Well, hello everybody and welcome to the next lecture in the course this week. And what I want to talk about this week is a little bit about carrying on about convolutional neural networks. So just starting from the beginning on this one. Convolutional neural networks. So we had a little chat about it a while ago, and this is like a follow-on and a bit more depth, I guess you could say. So what are we talking about with convolutional neural networks? Well, we'll sort of introduce it one thing at a time, I guess. And what we mentioned last week or last time in the outline was that the first question is, what is machine vision, which is what I've been trying to explain, I guess, for the last so many weeks. What is convolution? I tried to go into that one as well. What's machine learning? What's neural networks? And then what is deep learning? And again, the question is, why do people like using it? And why do some people not like it? And what do you need to do to get deep learning working? And I put a few case studies, one of which is, of course, grass vision, which I keep talking about, where we have it working in Scotland at a farm, where we got it on the back of the tractor. And although it takes a long time to train the neural network in terms of deep learning, you can consult it quite quickly and easily. So although, the training was fairly formidable, when we got it on the back of the tractor, all we need to do is have a camera or a set of cameras, maybe 8 cameras along a long spraying beam. And then we look at a certain section of grass. And then we apply the CNN, and the CNN will give us a very quick response as to whether there's any grass there or not. And if there is, we just spray it over the section that we viewed. And if there isn't, of course, we don't. That's the first initial way of doing it that we're just getting off the ground. As things get a little bit more complicated and a bit more in depth, you would be able to be a bit more directional, probably. So the ultimate idea is to direct by means of the servo, say. I mean, you could use just a spray controlled with controlling the direction of spraying to spray a little bit of herbicide on the actual weed on the dock, or you could try and zapping it with a laser. If you had a high power laser available, we could burn that weed. But considering moving along, that may be a little bit tricky. But other ideas that have been experimented with by people we know and ourselves a bit is microwaves. If you can send microwaves at it, of course, microwaves are quite a sort of low-cost thing to produce. Any microwave oven's got a device in it for generating microwaves that are quite damaging. But again, you need enough exposure to actually burn the weed and destroy it. Or you could mechanically hoe it out, I guess, with some kind of robot attachment. That's another possibility. But the point I was trying to make is that when you know exactly where that weed is, then you can direct whatever it is you're doing specifically at it and eliminate it without spraying everything everywhere, which is what they've been doing up to now. And there are, of course, many, many applications of machine vision and CNNs or deep learning. This is just one example we've been working on. We've got some other good ones in agri-tech, such as looking at pigs, whereby you can, to us all pigs look the same, but to a CNN, or to pigs themselves, they can differentiate between one pig and another, and the CNN is capable of doing that. So you don't have to go to the trouble and expense of having radio tags, RFID tags. You don't have to hurt the animal by putting these tags through the ears. You just look at their faces when they come for a drink, and you can identify them that way pretty reliably. And Mark Hansen's been working on this, and the latest thing he's done is he said that you can also identify their emotional state. It might sound incredible, but we've got evidence it's true. Because we're working with the Scottish Agricultural College, and Mel appeared on a series which is on Netflix about this, actually, which I can put some details on Blackboard. But basically, the advantage of that was it allowed us to have ground truth data. Because up in Scotland, they had 2 sets of pigs, for example. One lot which had been given some treatment, which they needed, so they're the happy ones, and another lot which have not been given the treatment, and they're the unhappy pigs. So we got 2 sets of pigs, one lot happy, another unhappy, and then we applied a CNN to learning and differentiating between them, and lo and behold, we were able to do it. So we got lots and lots of applications, not just Mel's doing a lot with the agri-tech deep learning applications, and I'm doing quite a lot with the medically related ones. So one idea in medical was to take the skin analyzer, which I've talked about quite a bit, and to look at the 3D data as well as the 2D from that, from moles, and then to use that in deep learning to identify automatically features that might indicate cancer in the mole. So that's really quite an exciting project, because you might even be able to save lives if you can get that working in the health service. Another couple of interesting things that are coming out, especially in the COVID epidemic, and we got money for recently. Well, one was a thing called Green Care, where we're doing a virtual physiotherapy with Avatar in the computer. But the difference between this and most of this people who try to do this kind of thing is that we got a doctor from Harley Street involved who's very keen and very motivated in the technology. So we got a medically related diagnosis and direction of the physiotherapy. And the deep learning comes in there by means of having a camera and looking at the movements that the person makes and then analyzing them to determine exactly whether they're making their moves according to what you want them to do for the physiotherapy routine you want them to go through. And this, of course, is something that's very useful in COVID, because you can't necessarily have people going to people's houses, real physiotherapists, but you still want to have people getting the treatments, getting the training, and then the virtual physiotherapy, especially with a medical qualification, comes in there, and that's what we want to do. So we're trying to get that off the ground. And that's going to be launched for 6 months from the 1st of January next year. So it's starting up pretty soon. So those are the kind of things that we're trying to do, just a very, very quick snapshot of some of the things we've got going on. But let's carry on and talk a little bit more about what's going on with deep learning and CNNs. So I've got a little summary here. Convolutional neural networks automatically identify characteristics of a data set that can be used as reliable indicators. In other words, they automatically work out what the features are of interest for allowing us to determine whether something's there or not that we're interested in. Historically, the conventional approach was for researchers to put vast efforts into exhaustive sets of features for image classification. So in other words, we used to have to handcraft the features. We used to have to try to work out what it is in a set of data that indicates the presence or absence or condition of something we're interested in. And we might be able to do that. It would probably be a lot of work, and there's no guarantee that we'll get exactly right that we'll do it exactly right. There's no guarantee that we'll get the feature exactly right. So the great advantage of CNNs is that this is done automatically. So there isn't much question, it's bound to be right, because the system itself is finding that this feature is indicative of this characteristic we're interested in. Since the advent of deep learning CNNs, the conventional approach has been exceeded in accuracy for almost every data type. Now, this is why it's such a great breakthrough. It works very well. It works considerably better, really, than any non-machine learning techniques, to be honest, for automatic identification of features of interest in images. It's one of the few breakthroughs that you could say has been a real breakthrough in AI, and enabling all sorts of tasks to be undertaken, in difficult, complex environments where there's a lot of variation, light changing. That's quite important, because if you talk to people who work and lead CEOs of companies who are implementing face recognition, for example, commercially, you find that they say that they can probably have a job getting above 95% reliability with 2D techniques, conventional 2D techniques. And the reason for that has been that something as simple as light changes. The change in the direction, orientation, nature, intensity of the light causes remarkably and unexpectedly serious problems in face recognition. But this is an example of the kind of variation that a CNN is very good at dealing with. It can deal with complexity in terms of changes in orientation, shadowing, light changes, and it can still give you decent results, which is why it's robust, and that's why it's so useful. Another serious problem that anybody would have who's launching a company, I think, that's trying to implement face recognition commercially, is that it's a little bit unclear, and this is not a technological problem, this is more like a social or political problem, but it's a little bit unclear as to what the exact situation is regarding what's acceptable and what's not in terms really of social acceptance of face recognitions in public areas, especially in regards to what kind of what kind of permissions are needed to do this for people. I mean, that's a bit ironic, you could argue, because when you walk down the street in the UK, in any city, you're getting photographed hundreds of times anyway by these cameras. Security cameras are already there. But from the point of view of face recognition for applications that might be used commercially, it's still up in the air a bit, and they're looking for some more guidance, from the government and the regulatory bodies on this. That's why quite a few companies are going bust, because as there's more uncertainty, people get a little bit nervous, and they're not necessarily willing to invest in these new systems if they're not sure they're going to be acceptable in a few years' time. So quite a few companies have gone bust that I know of who are trying to do this at the moment. But it's a big long-term growth area, of course. It will be eventually really taking off. You could argue it's a bit like the situation 100 odd years ago when you had a car and you had to have someone walking in front of it waving a lantern. You've got something going on which is crippling the technology just because people haven't sufficiently got into it and accepted it yet, I guess. Now, I did a sketch of Geoffrey Hinton because he's probably the main man in the history of deep learning and CNNs. And there's a quote from him. Take any old classification problem, we have a lot of data, and it's going to be solved by deep learning. That's going to be thousands of applications of deep learning, and I think he's probably right there. That's about it. And one thing that Geoffrey Hinton's always done is to try to emulate, if you like, or he's tried to reproduce the way the human brain works and try to implement that in a computer. That's what he's trying to do. And of course, the way in which that's done is limited in terms of similarity to the actual human brain, and it's obviously much simpler than the human brain. So that's why he says, if you hear more quotes from him, that there's a lot of work to be done. We're just getting off the ground, but we're making progress. I think it's quite interesting to talk about things like spiked networks and to think about the way a neural network actually works. I talked about feed-forward backpropagation as being the way it works. In fact, backpropagation was one thing that was popularized by Geoffrey Hinton, so that's one of his claims to fame, and he's probably a big area for him. But the human brain doesn't really use feed-forward and backpropagation. That's just a way of emulating a neural network in a computer. That's one thing that Geoffrey says quite a bit. He says that the human brain doesn't do that, but that's what we have to do to make it work. So he's always looking for things like, what can we implement networks which are more similar to the way the human brain works? He talks about spike networks, and spikes being looking for variation in an environment or a scene. So if you've got a network which is just looking for changes in the scene, that would be like a spiked network. And the thing is, this is the way the human brain works, I think, because if you look at a scene, your eye seeks out contrast and detail. You're naturally drawn to that, and that's what's the eye and the brain are processing this change, which is associated with where you've got contrast or detail. And that's really what we're talking about. It's like a scene where things are changing. It could be changing temporally or changing spatially just in the scene, but things where things are going on, that's what the network wants to focus on. And this is an area of research that is quite big, but it's quite a difficult one because it's quite difficult to work out how you should get the network to analyze the things that are changing. This isn't something I'm going to get into in depth in this course. It's a little bit beyond what we can do in this course, but I thought it's quite interesting the way that Geoffrey Hinton's looking at this, what he's doing. So the CNN is a method that was developed for image recognition then, tasks by taking inspiration from the biological brain, in particular the connective topology of the neurons in the visual cortex. So this is where the convolution bit comes in. Convolution is like the visual processing in the eye, and that's where you're looking at both the eye and the brain. The neural network is more like the brain part of the simulation. Geoffrey Hinton popularized backpropagation, as I was just saying, and described the AlexNet system, which he conceived for the ImageNet challenge. This was like a competition that used to go on every year to see who could get most accuracy in recognizing faces from a database of so many million images. And he sort of got a bit of a breakthrough with this system. That he got a student and he told the student what to do with this AlexNet, and it worked remarkably well. AlexNet outperformed all the other approaches by a wide margin, as it says there. 15.3% error versus an expected 26.2%, a very significant decrease in error. Subsequently, this method was universally accepted and largely adopted by the machine vision community. So this is what got convolutional neural networks on the page. And that other thing, just going back to the previous slide that's mentioned there, the ImageNet, challenge is the ImageNet database on the internet, which consists of so many million, 14 million images in different categories. And this is used a lot for training CNNs, just doing basic training of CNNs, because something I'm going to talk about a little bit later on is transfer learning. And transfer learning is where you take a CNN which has been partly trained usually using the ImageNet database, or you could use a different one, but quite often using the ImageNet database. And then you introduce some of your own data, and you use that data of your own to really further train it, to give it the specialization in the data that you're working with. And you wouldn't expect that to work very well, but it does work very well. It doesn't work as well as if you train the deep network exclusively with your data from scratch, but it works pretty well. It probably works better than any performance you can get with any other technique apart from deep learning. But just going back to this one, it wouldn't be right to say that the only person who's ever done anything in deep learning and CNNs is Geoffrey Hinton, because there are a number of, there's actually 3 guys, and they're called the godfathers of AI, actually. You can look this up on the internet, it's quite a lot of information. But another important one is Yann LeCun. And Hinton advised Yann LeCun back in, can you believe it, 1999. And then LeCun came up with a thing called LeNet 5, because he was French, probably all this less stuff comes from. But he now works in the States. And so LeNet 5 and 7-layer CNN recognized human handwritten digits. So, banks were very interested in this because they're trying to read checks automatically. LeCun comes up with this pretty impressive CNN that's able to read writing on a check, and the banks are still using it now. So that tells you how good what he did was. So you could argue that he rigged up the first CNN, really, that was really commercially used. And so some people think, he's famous, justifiably famous for that. And so Yann LeCun with his 7-layer CNN. There's 1 or 2 others, you can look them up as well on the internet. There we go. That's my little sketch of him there, Yann. So what we got then in deep learning, a state-of-the-art situation, is that we've got acquisition, of course. Then we've got some pre-processing, feature extraction, and classification. These are the different stages in the deep learning process. And we do this with a neural network. So the pre-processing and the feature extraction is coming out with the convolutional part of the neural network, and then towards the back of the neural network, we've got a fully connected neurons, which is more like a regular, neural network, and that's where we do the classification. This is the sort of structure we're looking at. And this is kind of meant to be showing some of that structure. So why is deep learning so popular? Well, a lot of things get a lot of hype around them, but in this case, I think the hype might be justified. And because it works, that's a pretty good reason for liking it, and doesn't cost that much. I mean, a lot of the stuff like the software you can use, Google Colab, which is very good, which has even got a GPU online you can use for implementing CNNs. Then, of course, Keras, which is very impressive, and with TensorFlow, use those together, and then you've got a very powerful potential for producing CNNs. The only thing about that is you do need to install some NVIDIA software, which takes about a day. So it takes a long time. NVIDIA is a great company doing some great stuff with GPUs, but their software is quite elaborate. It takes about a day. And the nightmare, actually, if you're not careful with all this, is that you've got to get exactly the right versions of NVIDIA software to work with a particular version of Keras. It's going to work with a particular version of TensorFlow, and they change on these all the time. So it's a bit fluid. But if you can get it rigged up and working, then you're really in business. And I've got it working on a few computers. In the lab, we've managed to get it working on quite a few computers. And so the advantage of all that software I just mentioned is that Google Colab is up and ready for you to use. All that getting the right system stuff has been done already for them. It's online. You can use it. Then also the advantage of all this I've been talking about is that this software is sort of public domain usage. It's not, you don't have to pay massive license fees. So you can get up there and use it without a big cost. Talking about that kind of thing, you may find that the other system way of doing it might have a fee you might have to pay, but that is with with MATLAB. And MATLAB comes with some very impressive toolboxes I used to use over the years. I made a lot of use of the neural network one about 20 years ago onwards. But the one that you can use here is the deep learning toolbox, and actually it's very impressive, as all the MathWorks software is really very powerful. But you do need to get into it. You do need to pay if you're going to commercially exploit it, which is what we do in our lab. You would have to pay a license to MathWorks. So companies are not too keen on doing that, as you can imagine. So, but it's a great one for doing some research and doing some instruction work on, really. And so, as I say then, so it's comparatively low cost and a unique community that generates free-to-use frameworks, database, and code, which is what I was just talking about. So this might be where you're trying to analyze this and do some modeling here. This is looks like a heat map. It's really just the different colors are indicating how frequently the system, the network, would reference different parts of the image to identify the information they're trying to withdraw from it. And this is showing the error, or the loss as they call it, decreasing as the network trains. So this is the error, if you like, or the loss, but the difference between what the network's thinking is out there, a given point in the image, and what actually is there according to the ground truth data. So that's how well, so the lower this goes, the better the network is at recognizing things. And this shows the network actually recognizing things, because here we've got some segmentation going on. We've got a busy scene with all sorts of things in it, and the different colors indicate different sorts of things that have been segmented. So we've got these cars here in green, and we've got the pedestrian in orange, and the lights are looking like they're in blue and purple, and so on. We've got different features, and this is done automatically by the system. So why is it unpopular? Well, again, it might be because of the hype. I mean, I don't like hyping myself too much in various ways, especially when people are trying to sell you things. But, as I say, I think in this case, the hype might be more justified than in a lot of other cases. Because it just works is another one that we might say here. Why have I put because it just works there? Well, people in industry a lot of the time don't like it because it just works. They like to know how it works. They like to get an equation out, which will tell them it's working because it's following this equation. So in this case, it's a bit like a black box. The model is in the weights, it's in the network. It's a very complicated network, and it's not obvious how it's working. It's just working. Now, as another reason why some people might not like it is that, as with all neural networks, as it says there is a certain art to them. So, there's a certain art to rigging up the architecture of them, unsatisfying guesswork at optimal architectures, although that applies to other feature extraction techniques as well. But people wonder, is there, when you say they ask you, what's the architecture you can use? I say use a couple of layers. They say, is there a reason for that? So yeah, the reason it works. But they like to have more things written down in a sort of formulaic way about how to approach things. But people don't like the way it's a little bit of an art to rigging up the architecture and also training of the neural network. For example, a neural network, including a deep learning neural network, is just basically a pattern recognition technique that works for a complicated data in images. So if you're trying to model something, it doesn't have to be images, it could be whatever you're trying to model, but we use it for images. If you're trying to model something, then there's a danger that you might overfit your model to the data, and you might find yourself modeling noise. I don't know if I can give you an example of this, but I don't know if I can give you an example. I don't know whether we can just use paint to show how this might work, but supposing that that you had some kind of graph. Okay, I may not be drawing this too well, but this is just meant to be a simple graph. Okay. And we may have some points on the graph. This is data points. Okay, I don't know exactly how this would work. Just it's not too important. I'm just trying to get some sort of concept across. But if I was trying to train this could be, there's an input and output. Okay, supposing the input's coming along here, it could be some industrial parameters. It could be the force you're applying to a press and the density of the part you're making out of powdered metal or whatever. And in the fact that that was the case, then you'd have the force would be going along the y-axis. It doesn't really matter what it is. It's just two sets of data in an industrial process. Now, if you had it'd be like fitting a very high order polynomial to this that goes through all these points. You could do that. If you fitted a very high order polynomial through this, you'd have it going through all these points. And the same thing's true of a network, of a neural network. You could train a neural network on this data, the X and Y data, such that the neural network predicts exactly for each of these points. The problem with that is that there's a lot of noise. As you can probably see, there's a lot of noise in this data. There's a lot of random variation. So if I had the same application but a different set of data, all the points would be in a different place. So my network, which went through all these points of training, wouldn't work on the next set of data for the same application. In other words, it wouldn't generalize. Okay, so we need a network that's going to generalize. We don't want to overfit it. We don't want to overfit the data. So again, exactly how you implement the overfitting in the network is a little bit not. It's a little bit of an art. It's a little bit of an art. So it could be that you limit the number of neurons in the network in order to make sure that it generalizes. Or it could be that you stop the training after a certain amount of training to prevent it from to make sure it generalizes. And by the way you make sure it has actually generalized is that when you train a neural network, before you train it, you split it into two sets of data. Maybe you split into 70% training data and 30% test data. Okay. And then you train it on the training data. The network does not see the test data, okay, for training. And then once you've trained it, then you consult it using the test data, okay? And the idea is it hasn't seen the test data before, so how well it works with that test data tells you how well it generalizes. And that's quite a good approach. And MATLAB's quite well developed in this way, because when you do that, it actually has got a thing called postreg, which will plot for you the performance of the network versus the test data. And if this was working perfectly in the network, you'd expect a nice straight line with a gradient of one, a nice gradient of one, a beautiful correspondence. But there is usually a bit of error because you're talking about real world data. So you get the data out of it, you get your error, and then it comes up with a correlation coefficient, which is telling you how well the network is working with the test data, how well it's generalized. And you could quantify it with the correlation coefficient, which is kind of nice. But going back to where we were on this, so it's a little bit of an art. Okay. And another reason you mightn't like it is that you've got to label the data, generally speaking. When you're using something like deep learning, there's two types of ways of doing it, and that is supervised learning and unsupervised. Supervised learning is where you put notes, if you like, on each image to say what's in the image. So if it was the weeds in grass, for example, you put a note on each image saying whether there's a weed there or not. And we did that for that application. The poor guys in the lab were looking at 6,000 images, and 6,000 images with tiny little bits of weed is even difficult. It's very monotonous and boring, actually, and it's very, it's not very exciting work, and it's quite difficult to determine for tiny bits of weed whether there's something there or not. So we did it for 6,000 images, but ideally, you want to do unsupervised learning, I guess, where you don't do that. Unsupervised learning, the machine itself works out what's in the image, if you can believe that. It looks for patterns in the image. But that's not necessarily used or considered as reliable as supervised learning. So by and large, we might expect ourselves to have to do some labeling when we're using these systems in practice at the moment. It can be a bit laborious. Non-deterministic, yeah, we don't have a deterministic solution. It's a database solution. We don't get an equation out of it. So people in industry like to have equations, straight lines that you normally use, but they like some kind of deterministic solution. And it's unclear how licensing exists in the models themselves based on licensed images and how they can be used in commercial applications. Yeah, so that's a little bit unclear. You might have some images that are licensed, but by the time you've done your deep learning and got your network fully trained, does the licensing, how does it relate to the trained network? It's a little bit unclear in the law at the moment, to be honest. Popular architectures are something called a mask RCNN. It's built on ResNet and segments instances of classes. So this is getting a bit more into the way the deep learning actually works, the actual architecture for the network. You can look this up in a bit more detail yourself. This is one of the best ones. It's a very powerful one. ResNet 101 is a type of architecture. What do you need to implement this kind of system? Well, you can do it nowadays remarkably easily. You can even get a USB stick that has it, can do neural network computation on the NVIDIA stick. I mean, you could have that plugged into a camera, a smart camera, and you could be doing it all up on the wall. It wouldn't even necessarily need to be having a network and doing it all on a big computer somewhere. You just do it. And there's a lot of debate about whether you're better off with a centralized system where you can do the neural network learning centrally, and whether you want to do it sort of modular way with particular learning on particular cameras, smart cameras. And it's not particularly clear at the moment. It might become clearer. It depends on what you're trying to do, probably. Yeah, so what you need to get this going is you need some kind of computer, generally speaking, you do need a GPU, really, because it is a number crunching intensive sort of process. So if you've got a GPU, it's going to make your life a lot easier, and you're going to get it done much quicker. RTX being quite good, buy some quite good computers with GPUs already built in nowadays. Yeah, you could use a Raspberry Pi with NVIDIA's compute stick. We've done that, and we got that working for various sort of real-world applications. And this is what I was talking about a minute ago, really. One possible problem is there's so much to choose, so many different decisions to make. MATLAB's great, of course. OpenCV, yeah, great, yeah, but you have to get into the C programming a bit. PyTorch is still Linux only. A lot of people like Linux, but that would probably throw me. Actually, since I generated these slides were generated, things have probably moved on a little bit, so I should have to look this up. CAF, has the zoo. Keras and TensorFlow work everywhere, but you've got to be careful that the latest version is actually stable and that it's compatible with the NVIDIA, whatever else you've got. They're going to try and make it more simple, I think, as to how all these packages work together. NVIDIA are trying to work on a shell, which will make it easier for you to install all these packages without going through spending a whole day on it, like I have done up to now. But yeah, so you've got a lot of choice of different ways of implementing it. There are, though, a tremendous amount of amazing resources online for all this, and a lot of people are doing all sorts of kind of work. And it's really worth going through that if you're getting into it to get some help on it. There's some good lectures as well. Some guys in the States have created courses using Google Colab, for example. So that's got the advantage that you wouldn't have to keep trying to install all these packages if you're in a lab. You just get people online in your lab, and they can start using the Google Colab online GPU and CNN. So there's loads of resources for all this. And this is one that, as I say, Mark is working on. Why do you want to do pig recognition? This was precision farming, identification of individuals allows tailored treatment, RFID. RFID, radio frequency tagging, is a right pain, actually. So there are many reasons why you don't want to use RFID tags, apart from not being a bit cruel for the animals. A bit expensive having these RFID tags. And also, in the farmyard, you might think it wouldn't be a problem, but we experience a lot of problems with the radio frequency interfering with other systems on the farm. So you can do away with all that just by having the face recognition with the deep learning. Feasibility studies here it's possible given a small gene pool, unconstrained capture environment, some insight into whether it might work in other species, and it looks like it will. They've got quite a nice little system working on a laptop, which I took down to the festival, Festival of Nature down in Bristol, down at the Millennium Square, and the kiddies were quite enjoying it because we had these different pictures of these pigs, like sausage and whatever they were called, these different pigs, and bacon and all these names they had for these pigs. And they were just having a printout of the pig on a piece of paper, and they were putting it up in front of the camera, and the system was automatically identifying which pig it was. So it was kind of amusing for the kids. And this is a rogues gallery for the pigs. They all look very similar to us, but the computer's able to differentiate them. 10 pigs, we had 5,000 images. We've got videos captured using a webcam at the drinker the pigs will go into, removing very similar frames. The dot approach is used successfully for human face recognition. This is quite remarkable. There's some CNNs that have been developed for human face recognition, and we found that adopting, pre-trained networks there with a limited amount of pig data worked remarkably well. Actually, not as well as training completely with big data, but pretty well, maybe 85% reliability or something like that. So there we have showing some of the performance. Train your own network on the faces gives the best results, as I say. Extracting features that are useful for human recognition still gives excellent performance for pigs. Fisher face gets it correct 4 out of 5 times. High false positive, false negative rates. And they replicated the results on 40 plus pigs. So, yeah, our CNN was giving an accuracy of 96.7 for these pigs, which I thought was pretty good. These other conventional techniques, support vector machine, the type Fisher face and so on, was giving it quite limited compared to that. We were getting some nice accuracy on the pig recognition. We got another project following on from it because it worked so well. That was the emotional pig I was talking about earlier. So this little heat map here is kind of interesting because it shows the amount of time that the network concentrates on various parts of the pig in order to get the differentiation ability working for telling the pigs apart. In other words, what areas are of interest to the CNN. They also make sure that there isn't using some other feature unrelated to the pig itself. It could be something occurring in the image, which is not actually on the pig's face, but something that happens that could be causing errors. So make sure that's not happening. 3D face recognition was another good one. I wrote a paper and presented it at a New York conference last year. Actually, this year it was, in the summer. But I had to do it remotely because of the virus. But 2D deep face recognition gave performance step change on data sets. 3D deep face recognition is relatively unexplored due to the lack of data sets, to be honest. One of the first data sets that was available generally was our PhotoFace data set, by the way, which we generated back in 2008 and put onto the internet. As it says, our PhotoFace database is one of the largest, but only has a few thousand images of around 400 people. So that seemed like a lot to get that up together, but the more the merrier when it comes to this data. So this, what we've got here is 3D data from face. Now, with this, we can demonstrate something called data augmentation. Okay, and that's what this paper was about, because as it says, the validation of training left and the validation right accuracy during the training process. Okay, so this is how the training improved, the accuracy improved with training epochs, the number of training epochs, and the accuracy improved. That's a training of the pure training data, and this is how well it worked on the test data. But what the idea of this was, you can say it's pretty good accuracy, you can see it going up to 1 there, nearly fully accurate. We got the 3D data, and if you can imagine, we rotated it. We rotated the faces, and this is what this is showing. We're rotating the faces in the computer, and then we're adding these rotated faces to the database. And this is what data augmentation is, where you take the data and you mess around with it, if you like, and then put that into the database. You could reflect it, you could change the color channels, you could just rotate it like this. You can zoom in and out maybe. And then this extra data, you wouldn't have thought that would work, but this extra data does help you improve the accuracy, which you can do the 3D face recognition. So that's quite an interesting finding. That's why we've got a paper out on that. I could probably put that paper onto Blackboard for you. And a presentation I gave for it, which might be useful as well. Presentation intention prediction was another project we worked on the lab. So trying to work out whether people on the curb of light to step out into the road use dense pose to extract body pose. They got across. Did recognize walk in action less than 7 frames. So that was pretty successful as well, I think, really, that project. So it goes to show how you can apply deep learning to a wide range of different applications. Extracting phenotype traits. We've done a lot of work on looking at plants and phenotyping. What genes are expressed under different environmental conditions was a question. Automate what is a very manual and laborious process so far. They're doing this manually, looking at these plants, but we can calibrate it. We use near-infrared photometric stereo. That worked very well in terms of reflection from the leaves. To extract orientations and size measurements without interfering with the growth cycle of the plant. Because if you've got a leaf that's at an angle, if you're just using a 2D image, you get an error in the measurement of the area of the leaf because it's rotated, you get a parallax error. But with our system, we can work out the orientation of the leaf, so we can correct that and get an accurate measure for the growth of the plant at any given time. So we're working with Edinburgh University. They've got these growing machines where they're changing the amount of water, the other parameters, and then we're able to give them more accuracy on the measurements of the leaf areas. Got some nice papers out of that. Automated leaf tracking. We can actually track the leaves. It's not as easy as you might think, because the leaves move around during growth, and they can be occlusion going on, shadowing, and so on. Work quite well with there's a ground truth data, and then the mask CNN. We use a mask RCNN to get working. It worked quite well. Gitis did his PhD on this area. Now he's working on a KTP in related area. KTP is a knowledge transfer partnership. It's a way we take things forward with companies. The person working on that works technically for UWE, but based at the company normally, and they do all sorts of development to help get products to market. That's what a KTP is. It's rigged up by Innovate UK, which is a major funder of our work. So it's tracking the leaves there. These, if you didn't have the leaf labeling with the CNN, you get all sorts of errors going on. But when you're tracking it with the CNN, you can see we've got pretty good reliability on these leaves. Identification. And we've also used all sorts of other areas. Like there was a project with a company in London. In the UK, you've got a lot of old buildings where they want to put insulation in under the floors, but the old buildings got problems like pipes and walls and things under the floors. And the idea is that on the robot that they send under the floor, we installed our camera and we use deep learning. And you can see here that we're able to identify different obstructions and classify them. Under the floor, we're getting identification of these floorboards, of this wall, of these different types of materials. It worked pretty well. Got quite a nice system for them. It would help them. Once they've mapped out the situation under the floor, then they could just send the robot in again and spray the insulation where, move the robot around according to the map that they've got of what's going on under the floor. Quite a nice application. So summarizing then, deep learning is showing what neural networks have always been capable of, given sufficient data, computing power and cooperation. So this is the real, this is allowing neural networks to fly because it's allowing them to work in more unstructured situations. A CNN offers a means of designing tailor-made kernels to extract the best features. So the kernels are used in the convolution. That's where the convolution comes in. They're with the kernel, you might remember, is the mask that's moved over the image to do the filtering, and that's a convolution. So that the type of kernels you use determines why the performance of the CNN is going to be. Every conference and journal issue is literally crammed full. I can vouch for this, having gone to one recently, or gone to a couple recently. It's crammed full of deep learning papers, and that's great, and it shows how powerful the technique. The trouble is, it's very hard to see who's doing some genuinely novel work and so where real breakthroughs are going on, because everybody's doing the same kind of thing, I guess you could say. From a practical point of view, they deliver a robustness to the real world that's previously been unseen in machine vision, and therefore enables us to really expand the number of applications and types of usefulness of machine visions into outdoor applications and unstructured indoor applications and all sorts, which is what you've got in the real world. You don't want to spend you don't want to get into a situation where you're spending more time, effort, and money on structuring your environment than you are if you've just done it manually. But so by able to handle unstructured situations, you can have machines that can deal with all sorts of problems automatically. And when there's lack of data, we can apply this idea of transfer learning, was the first thing I mentioned, where you use a previously part-trained network and then introduce a bit of your own data. It works quite well. And data augmentation, where you take the data, alter it a bit, and then you increase the data set. And that also improves the accuracy of the CNN. This enables good pattern recognition even when it's relatively small. Amazingly, even when there's like 35 images per class, it still works pretty well. And that paper I put onto the online, it gives you some detail of this, the grass vision one. It should be fairly self-explanatory. Worth reading through that. I definitely advise you to read through that paper. So that's it. Thanks very much for that. That's the sort of the second part of the introduction to CNNs. I hope it was reasonably understandable. And I'll see you guys next time.